One of the great cultural unifiers in the human project is drilling holes in our head. Nearly 10% of the Neolithic skulls we've found have at least one man-made hole in them. Skulls in Peru, Greece, China, Egypt, and a few that are still walking around, like an accountant in England who wanted a hole in his head to relax. Doctors did it, mystics and shamans did it, and now one of the richest men alive has made it part of his vision for the future. I'm going to trepann Joe Melon here until I heal his brain trauma, cure his migraines, and release his mind from the grips of unrelenting evil, all with the increasingly sophisticated application of physics, and hopefully without killing him. It's gonna take a couple tries. We've been scraping, cutting, and reaming into each other's heads for 7,000 or 8,000 years, and for 99% of that time, we had no idea what we were doing. We didn't know how it worked, and we didn't know even if it worked. The fact is, your skull evolved to keep out threats to your life and your consciousness, so why do we keep trying to drill our way in? In 1965, Bart Hughes used a dentist drill to trepann himself in the forehead. He was trying to increase the blood supply to his brain, which he called blood-brain volume. That's all one word, blood-brain volume. He engaged in the deliberate perforation of his cranium to expose the intracranial space, which a number of writers and scholars describe as continuing the tradition of humanity's oldest surgery, which is almost definitely wrong. There's some terminology and semantics here that's actually more than just semantics. Tabor's Cyclopedic Medical Dictionary, which has been a standard reference book in medicine and law since the 1940s, defines surgery as the branch of medicine dealing with manual and operative procedures to correct deformities and defects, repair injuries, and diagnose and cure certain diseases. All of that is surgery. Trepanning is just the oldest surgery that we have surviving evidence of. Strategically cutting into bone that has a density of 1.6 to 1.8 grams per cubic centimeter is really hard to do. And some of the basic soft tissue and surface plasties and raphes and otomies would have been much easier and more common. But soft tissue doesn't really survive the way bone does, and the primitive cutting tools used for Neolithic surgeries were often things like sharp flints, stuff that's indistinguishable from items used more generally, like for hunting, weapons, or butchering. There wouldn't be any special evidence. But we probably didn't start with craniotomies and only then decide to take a shot at the surgical debridement of burns and open wounds. Wait, so why did your great-grandfather 257 greats ago carve a hole in his best friend's head? We can actually make some pretty good guesses. Dr. Plinio Prioresci's medical anthropology work found that male Neolithic skulls show disproportionate evidence of trepanning, because they probably got hurt more often. Trepanning was likely done for a few reasons. One, in response to trauma, which is supported by the frequent presence of cranial fractures, from hunting accidents, combat, from just slipping on a wet rock, cracking your head open because you were trying to reach a really cool stick. Research and meme accounts show dudes just get hurt more. Trepanning was also likely done to treat acute infections and as a psychosurgical intervention in cases of severe mental illness, which is actually a really sophisticated concept because it shows an understanding of the relationship between the brain and behavior. And maybe it was just for pain relief. Forensic anthropologist John Verano's book Holes in the Head, The Art and Archaeology of Trepanation in Ancient Peru describes Incan skulls with up to 7 different holes in them. That suggests trepanation was applied several times for less serious afflictions like migraines, in addition to the Incan predilection for full contact warfare. Thousands of years later, Count Philip of Nassau was trepanned 27 times to relieve his headaches. Trepanned Iron Age skulls include women and children too. Prioreshi suggested that higher status members of tribes tended to be trepanned, so you really had to be useful to others to be eligible for a hole in your head. Cool. So, how did they make the hole? Scraping. Scraping using a sharp flint or a piece of glass to scrape through nearly a centimeter of bone until it got a hole in it. It's time to trepann Joe Melon. I don't know how thick Joe Melon's rind is any more than Dr. Krog knew how thick Chief Crag's skull was after he got mauled by a raging howler monkey. Depending on the cultivar, watermelon rind ranges from 7 to 24 millimeters, so we'll just have to find out. I just know that it's a lot softer than bone. I don't have any caveman tools, so I shattered a glass jar. I put this glove on so that I don't cut myself on the glass, and I want to scrape down until I can barely see the red part. It's actually more complex than just being a rind. The green part is Joe's exocarp, which is like his scalp, and I want to scrape through that to get to the mesocarp, which is like his skull, without poking the endocarp of his brain so hard that he dies. Here we go. How you holding up there, Joe? He's got a thick head. Where is your brain, Joe? Where is your brain? Oh, I can see it. I can see his watermelon brain. Can't say I ever thought I would do this in my life. And please don't do this at home. But anthropologist Paul Braca recreated this Neolithic trepanation process in 1859. He wanted to see what it was really like and how long it took to scrape through. Braca only needed 4 minutes for a very young person's skull, but he needed 50 minutes to get through a fully calcified adult skull, including short breaks when his hand got sore. According to Charles Gross in A Hole in the Head, that scraping method persisted in Italy until the Renaissance. You could also sort of cross-hatch 4 intersecting lines and use the corners of the inside square to define the area you needed to cut all the way through. It's actually a pretty good use of geometry, and all it costs is some extra grooves around the hole. Making 4 tiny holes or impressions and then connecting the dots worked too. Instead of a pointy, sharp cutter like an arrowhead, I'm going to use a box cutter. Uh-oh. All right, that method was really hard to control how deeply I went into his skull, and I almost definitely scraped out some of Joe Melon's brain matter here, so that one probably killed him. Whatever that means, because the notion of death is an important part of Prioreshi's theories. Did early peoples consider a state of unconsciousness to be death, in which sometimes people became undead by waking up? It makes a lot of sense using that framework. Sometimes we can undead someone and sometimes we can't. And if trepanning seemed a way to help undead people, then, well, keep doing it. And this is the crazy thing about all this. It's shocking how many people actually lived. We know whether trepanation coincided with a patient's death because we can see evidence of the cranium not having healed. If there's no healing, then that body didn't get a chance to slowly repair its wound. In late Iron Age Switzerland, trepanation survival was as high as 78%. We know the numbers, what we don't know is exactly what they mean. Did they die from illness or injuries, or did they die from the hole? It's also a selection issue. If a culture reserves trepanation only for lower risk cases, giving up on the higher risk hopeless people, a lot more will survive. Does 78% mean the Iron Age Swiss were great trepanners or great at triage? We don't know. We don't know their rules. Hippocrates had rules. Hippocrates defined much of what medicine is and isn't and should be, and he mentioned trepanation 22 times in his treatise on wounds in the head, because he suggested trepanation for nearly everything. The contusion, whether the bone be laid bare or not, and the fissure, whether apparent or not, and if when an indentation by a weapon takes place in a bone, it be attended with fracture and contusion, and even if contusion alone without fracture be combined with the indentation, it requires trepanning. Those bones which are most pressed and broken require trepanning the least. Hippocrates improved on trepanation devices that had been very simple, essentially a handle holding a scraping cutting point. This is a tool for electricians to jab holes in sheetrock, and it's basically the same thing. What's nice about a handle with a sharp point is that you can inscribe and then scrape a circle cleanly, so you can make a hole without a drill. Here's a question. What do you do with the circular core that was just removed? You wear it around your neck. The September 1875 issue of Popular Science included a story on a discovery by a Dr. Prunier who found trepanned remains in Lozère, and he also found cranial amulets made from the cores. And if that sounds only like a macabre, primitive thing to do, consider that the February 1893 issue of Popular Science tells a story about Mrs. N, who testifies that her husband, Mr. N's skull, needed trepanning after she threw a door open and the handle jammed deep into his head. Now he wears a plate of silver over the hole, and I wear the portion cut out of his skull in this brooch. The accident, I suppose my distress and remorse, brought about a rapprochement. We became engaged and are now man and wife. Holy matrimony. Innovation in the Hippocratic era brought a relatively secure axis of rotation that could be manipulated with two hands. The simpler T-style works a lot like this corkscrew, but its overall proximity to the cranium makes it hard to keep perfectly perpendicular to the surface, and it's even harder to know exactly when to stop. It's a Dura Mater destroyer. Look how clean this trepanation from Italy is. Things were getting better. This bow-style noggin reamer not only sped up the boring, you can imagine why you'd want that to go as quickly as possible, but it also made it easier to situate the device and hold it in place. A lot less tipping and extraneous damage. And honestly, the general mechanism of trepanation has barely changed since the Greeks. The tech just got incrementally smoother, like this tooth-boring bit roughly from the time of Julius Caesar and Jesus, which is pretty much the same thing as this hole saw I've attached to a brace bit drill, and this center point would be removed once the hole placement was established. But before Joe Mellon gets his final surgery, he should know that this is the best possible device for manual trepanation, and again, it's about physics. The success and efficiency of rotary trepanation depends on keeping the axis of rotation stable with total control over the downward force. I subjected Joe to some seriously uncomfortable cutting and reaming because I could only push down on a wobbly axis. This brace bit has a top that can be stabilized with one hand, and I could regulate the force as I operate the drill at whatever speed I need. There's about 14 centimeters from the axis of rotation to the center of the handle, so that makes a turning circumference of nearly 90 centimeters. Every 1 centimeter that I swing the handle results in 4 degrees of rotation. I have full control over the pace of cutting, which seriously reduces the chances that I'll cut into Joe's brain. But the hidden beauty of the brace bit is that when I get close to finishing, I can reduce the downward force by applying upward force to the handle on the top, almost like a brake that makes sure I can slow down and stop at the exact right depth. I can push down hard, I can use the natural weight of the drill, or I can reduce the force as close to zero as I need. Precision matters. There were actually some trepan models of this general style, like this one that's $1,495 on eBay, purportedly from the 1770s, with 10 people watching, which is weird. The ideal manual trepan would be fitted to the precise individual physical dimensions of its user so they could drill with the greatest possible circumference that still allowed them to maintain total stability of the axis of rotation and control the speed. All right, Joe is spinning, so I'm gonna tape him down. Look what you made me do, Joe. Let's hope this works. Oh, yeah. Joe! Joe is really dead now. He doesn't have eyeballs. Oh, now that is a hole. Luckily, it's just a watermelon. The perfect physics of the brace bit did not account for a wonky sphere on a table. There, I've got my amulet. All right, where were we? Hieronymus Bosch's 1494 The Extraction of the Stone of Madness shows a man being trepanned while still awake, and Foucault wrote that Bosch's famous doctor is far more insane than the patient he is attempting to cure. This guy just used a hammer. Dr. John Clark's 1664 portrait was one of the first made in America. You can see he's back to closeness of the single-handed trepan. The whole family's hanging out during this trepanation, including the dog. And there's a rat, which tells you something about why infection was so prevalent after trepanation. The concentration of disease in centralized urban 19th century hospitals became so dangerous that the threat of death from infection made trepanation an absolute last resort, because no one really knew then that they had to wash their hands. Hey look, the cat caught the rat, and now his owner's new head hole is safe from bubonic plague. Popular science articles from the 1880s and 90s show that we mostly relegated trepanation to research with animals, like experimenting with electrical impulses in the central nervous systems of frogs, or trying to vaccinate dogs against the scourge of rabies. We had to get to the brain somehow, and we still do. We stopped psychosurgical trepanation when we began to understand how the brain and mind actually worked. We still trepan to relieve increasing intracranial pressure or to expose part of the brain for surgery, not to let out the bad blood Hippocrates thought would fester and rot if not removed. And now, of course, we have mechanical drills, which is what an Englishman used to drill a hole in his head in an attempt to get permanently high. An Englishman named Joe Mellon. Mellon's memoir, Borehole, explains that what he really wanted was greater mental clarity and expanded consciousness. He trained to be an accountant, which he described as the most boring thing he'd ever done. He wanted to feel lighter. He immersed himself in the counterculture of the 1960s, which included heavy use of marijuana and LSD. He said he stayed up all night in Paris once after taking way too much of an over-the-counter drug, and in that one night, he wrote 20,000 words, mostly in rhyming couplets. That, was never published. He met Bart Hughes and found the concept of blood-brain volume compelling. The idea is simple. As our skulls solidify in adulthood, more intracranial pressure constricts blood flow in our brains. Less blood, less everything, less creativity, less relaxation, less happy. And Hughes theorized that it's made worse by humans having become upright. The brain parts we need most, like our language centers, are now at our most vertical point, which is hardest to deliver blood to due to gravity. By drilling a small hole in the front of his skull, Bart Hughes wanted to relieve just enough of that pressure to allow blood to flow more easily and for the cerebral spinal fluid that had taken its place to recede. The hole he made with a dentist's drill supposedly boosted his blood-brain volume. So Joe Mellon anesthetized his own drill site and spent 2 hours trying to bore a hole in his own skull with a hand trepan. It didn't work, so he bandaged himself up. He enlisted the help of Amanda Fielding for his second attempt. 3 years later, she released a documentary on her own self-trepanation called Heartbeat in the Brain. The footage alternated between her solo surgery and her pet bird Birdie. She ended up running for the British Parliament twice using the slogan, "Trepanation for the National Health." She'd eventually become Joe Mellon's first wife. But something went wrong midway through that second trial. Joe lost consciousness and had to be hospitalized. A third attempt made a very tiny hole, but it wasn't enough. In the spring of 1970, Joe was on his own. Amanda was away in New York City when he used an electric drill to make a hole just above the hairline on his forehead. He said, "I'd been drilling about half an hour when suddenly there was a burnout in the cable connecting the drill head to the motor. This really made me laugh." He bandaged himself up and took the drill to a carpenter friend downstairs who was able to fix it. Joe finished drilling into his head the next day, and there was more than just the ominous-sounding schlurp of his previous near success. A great gush of blood followed my withdrawal of the drill. Over the next 3 or 4 hours, I gradually got higher. Actually, the feeling I had was one of increasing lightness, literally as if a weight was being lifted from my mind. The real Joe Mellon is still alive, and so is Amanda, and after they split up, Joe married a woman named Jenny who also chose to trepan. None of them regret their decision, but there's no science at all to back up their claims. They all put holes in their heads with no actual proof that it did anything useful, which is exactly the same problem the Iron Age peoples had. You'd think that as we look to a future that might even include colonization on Mars, we'd have moved past crude experiments that involve drilling into people's heads. But it turns out we may have only just begun. Elon Musk's Neuralink implant is designed to use thought to control external devices. Its first recipient was announced in January of 2024. The process for implanting the Neuralink requires trepanation. We've spent 7,000 years drilling holes in our heads to let out blood, to let out pressure, to let out evil spirits and pain. The Incans, the Gauls, the Greeks, highly trained doctors, and eccentric individuals. Our cranial contents control our consciousness and our central nervous systems. Nothing is more precious. But after spending hundreds of generations risking our lives to get the spirits out, do we now have the knowledge, the technology, and the will to put them in? See you in the future.